Why did you write it? And what's it all about?
Well, I'll try the first question first. I wrote it because I grew up with stories that I heard from my mother about a madras that had completely, had evacuated during 1942, and her family and my father's family as well also fled. And as I grew up, I realized that there was not a single person I knew in Madras whose family hadn't fled. So I knew that there was a story somewhere that was crying out to be written. But as I researched the book, I discovered that it wasn't just Madras, it was pretty much all of India that was caught in this great flap. Um, and there was an exodus from many, many places, even in the interior, that has barely received historical notice. They're sort of major events. I think they're fairly major events. So, for instance, in April 1942, the British moved the capital of Odisha, which was Cuttack, to Sambalpur, inland, because they were scared of a Japanese attack. The Secretariat in a place like Cochin moved to Trishur. And I think people in Orissa and Kerala are barely even aware of this. So one part of the book is about this, the forgotten fact that India was caught in such a great flap, which is actually a British bureaucratic kind of expression to describe that period, and that there was a largely unmapped exodus from all over the country. There is a second part of the book which is the more serious historical part, where I claim that the events of 1942, when historians look at it, they look at the Cripps mission and Gandhi's call for Quit India as the sort of momentous events of 1942. But I try to argue that both those events have to be examined in the shadow of the Japanese threat, which is what they took place.
So, for folks in Bangalore, for example, did anything happen here that they need to know about? You don't need to tell us everything, but a little bit will help.
Well, I mean, if I have to talk about Bangalore, I have to put it in context. So, so essentially what happened is, so let me just backtrack a bit before I answer that, because without context, it may not make much sense. The day Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, they launch an operation in Southeast Asia. The one prong of which was, they attack Hong Kong, they bomb Singapore, but they invade Malaya, and that is what triggers the panic in India, because suddenly the war has come closer home. So people start fleeing within a week of the Malaya attack. So the flap begins in December 1941, even though it's called the Great Flap of 1942. So essentially, what happens is there is a panic all over the country. What happens in Madras is particularly significant because in Madras, the military intelligence of the British get it wrong. They actually tell Governor Hope, who was the governor of the Madras presidency then, that a big Japanese fleet with 10 divisions is about to make landfall south of Madras. And this leads Hope to actually disband his government. So departments scatter all over the presidency. So one department, the Accountant General Department, comes to Bangalore. But also Hope then, before taking this decision, actually flies to Bangalore, where he meets the official in the army to confirm, is this information really true? And he's told in Bangalore, yes, it is. So he goes back to Madras and disbands it. Hope also records that there was a lot of panic in Bangalore. So Bangalore is not central to the story, but certainly it figures like other places,
And I like, sorry, there's nobody here. This thing is not working properly. Anyway, so we'll have to keep a watch on time.
Yeah, it's only 2:36.
Okay, good. So one of the fascinating stories, or at least two of the fascinating stories that I'd like you to talk a little bit more about is, say, Madras. How many people were evacuated, and when they came back, what did they see?
Yeah, so again, I tried to do a calculation based on government reports and other estimates of how many people evacuated. Now, what happens with the government reports, which is really, communications by the chief secretary to the home secretary, then Eric Conran Smith, at different parts of this period between December and sort of June 1941, he gives you estimates of how many people have left. And if you add those estimates up, it comes to 55% of Madras fled. But if you go by the corporation records and the corporation debates, and also say an editorial in the Indian Express, they record that 75% at one time fled. But again, if you take the accounts of an ICS officer who remained in a completely deserted Madras, and also the estimate of, I think, the editor of the Swadeshi Mitran, I'm getting it wrong, the ICS officer and someone, he estimates that 90% of Madras fled. That they might have to do this. Months before that, the commissioner is actually writing to various places, including Mysore here and Erode and other places, saying, look, I'd like to transfer these animals out. And I found this, it's there in the records of the corporation that he tried to do this. And everywhere in the sort of time-honored bureaucratic tradition, the answer is, it's being considered. Give us some time. So the animals are not moved. And so finally, when this order is given, they have to be shot.
And somewhere, so I don't know, maybe there's a book waiting to be written on Pulla Reddy himself, because he protests and he tries his best.
Yeah, well, Pulla Reddy has written his biography, where he recounts this. And the account in his biography varies a little, which was written much later, varies a little bit between what he says in the corporation, and I think, it's there in the book. But he uses this very, very evocative expression on that day when, the government just moves. And, he's one of Hope's advisors is actually trying to get on the Blue Mountain Express, which leaves for Coimbatore and then goes up to Ooty. I think the train still exists in some way.
Yeah, it does.
And so he rushes there to meet this man, and he says, I can't speak now, I'm just hopping on the train. And Reddy is one of the few people who stay behind. Okay. He's asked to stay behind to deal with this. And he
because
has
he's one of the essential services people.
Yeah, so he describes this as a day when everybody seems to have lost his head because he protests against the killing of the animals. Yeah.
So moving on to your research itself, what were some of the difficult things that you had faced when you were doing the research? What were some of your aha moments?
Well, the Madras archives didn't throw up much. Most of the stuff I wanted in terms of geos, they couldn't locate. I suspect, and I'm not sure, I think this had to do with the fact that some of the war-related material were classified and they were moved out of the archives to the public department, and there's some notings to that effect, but I couldn't find it in the secretariat either. The story of the flap, which is essentially a story we've forgotten, is culled essentially from, mainly from two sources. One is the Viceroy's communications with various governors all over the country. Governor of Bengal, Governor of Bombay, Governor of Orissa, Assam, and so on. And funnily enough, I found that these were not mined in histories. Because otherwise, why would... And, I was at a gathering of Oriya intellectuals. Why would none of them know that Cuttack was evacuated? Surely somebody had told the story. So this was, something that surprised me as well.
And it's not even many generations before.
Yeah, it's just 1940.
People who...
Yeah. So that was, that was one, exciting piece of information. And then also there were lots of ICS officers at that time who left their personal records, which was there in the British Library. So there's, personal accounts which I mined for the story. So that was exciting too. I also went through a lot of newspapers, quite a bit, in fact, for that period. And I think some of the stories of the flap come from there. So I think there were many aha moments, because I think much of what is there is not what has been written about before. And I'll just take one more moment. I mean, you asked me what were the aha moments? I think I try to make a case that there's a reason why the story has been forgotten or shunted into, oblivion almost. And that's because I think our historians, our nationalist historians, were looking at everything through the lens of, this is how India got its freedom. Okay. So the Cripps mission, I mean, reams and reams of, paper have been spent analyzing it. Gandhi's Quit India call, again, has been the stuff of many PhD theses and so on. But the Japanese invasion, which led Madras to evacuate, Vishakhapatnam to completely empty out, 25% of Bombay at one point, possibly more to evacuate, 17% of Calcutta fled in 17 days in December. And there was more after that. Jamshedpur, there was a problem because people thought, Tata Steel being there, I mean, at that time, the steel company being there, the Japanese would attack them. There was panic, which I record, of white people in Kodaikanal. The Americans and the Europeans just fled Kodaikanal. And can you imagine people in sort of sequestered, hilly Kodaikanal panicking? So the story of the sort of almost, secular, if you like, panic across geography, across castes, communities, rich, poor, is sort of staggering. And yet we haven't taken note of it. So I think it was, I was actually, I didn't expect the book to turn out this way when I started working on it. But to me, just the fact that the flap is much bigger than it was when I thought it was when I started out, was something that gave me a lot of heart and hope going forward.
I'm very happy as a historian that people like you, with a lot of very rigorous scholarship, are looking at these kind of smaller episodes of history which deserve to be told. I really recommend the book because the writing is very lucid. A lot of sources are cited, so it's a very academic rigor is definitely there. I'd love for you to read a small passage. Tongues wagging was a chapter that I liked a lot, but I'm sure you'll have your favorite. We've got about 10 minutes, so if you could read a small portion and maybe take one or two questions.
I'm happy to take questions.
Okay,
and
so
read, yeah.
let's take one or two questions, and then if we have time, you could read much of it. Yeah.
Go the other way around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, did you also have to do research in the UK? For
Yeah, so most of it is, most of what I got was from the British Library. Of course, there's some material there which is also in India in the archives. And also I spent a little time at Kew at the National Archives. So I did spend some weeks at the British Library researching the book, and I think that without that, the book couldn't have been written. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
You mentioned the Japanese invasion. If I recall right, there was a German destroyer which took some shots at Chennai, Madras, and the ice factory area, and that led to a lot of panic. Is that?
No, that was World War I. I'm dealing with World War II.
Okay.
So that's the battleship Emden, which actually is a word that has got smuggled into the Tamil language as well. What happened in Madras actually in World War II was I'm talking about 1941-42, and by the end of 42, the Japanese are no longer the threat they were. But in 1943, there is a reconnaissance plane, a single reconnaissance plane that comes to Madras and drops some bombs on the harbor. And that's all that happened in Madras. So essentially, my story is like, what was all this fuss about? I mean, the Japanese never had a plan to invade India. But the British, thanks to certain measures that they took, thanks to the fact, and I think there's not enough time to address the questions, that they actually tacitly encouraged this exodus. They wanted people to leave cities because they thought the cities would be easier to defend. So there's a lot of very cold and somewhat heartless communication between Governor Linlithgow and his Governor General Linlithgow and other governors to say, look, it's not such a bad thing if people go, let them go.
Non-essential
So they're
people,
not,
I think
yeah,
is
they
the
call
word.
them useless mouths. We don't want useless mouths in the cities to feed. What they wanted was people engaged in war production and essential services to remain. And so the British treated the exodus as if it was a managerial problem, you know, how to get one set of people to go and another set to stay.
Yes.
Hello. My mother suffered it because during that time in Calcutta, there was a huge exodus which was taking place, and the Howrah Bridge and all were covered because the Japs were there to bomb it. So, and I think there were a couple of bombs which were thrown in Calcutta also at that point of time, but which didn't like. They weren't detonated or something like that. So what do you say about that? Like, Japanese didn't plan to attack British India, or
Yeah, well, good question. So what happens is that much of the panic and much of the exodus, even in Calcutta, so Calcutta is the first city where the exodus starts. It starts within a week of the assault on Malaya, which is December 1941. But it is first Vishakhapatnam, or what they call Vizagapattnam, and Kakinada, or Kokanada, that were bombed. Okay, that happens in April 1942. Calcutta, despite its importance and strategic importance, was bombed only much later. So, it was bombed at the end of the year, in a way, and it was bombed more than once. I mean, there was that period over Christmas that was bombed over successive days. And in Calcutta, there was a damage. But my story is really about a belief that the Japanese would invade India after they'd taken Malaya, Singapore, gotten to the, Dutch Sumatra. They'd taken the Andamans in March. And there was a fleet sent by the Japanese to the Indian Ocean, which actually bombed Colombo, and everyone thought that an invasion was imminent in India, and nothing happened. The Japanese, after they took Burma, which was a little later, they did a lot of occasional flights into India, bombing lots of places in the northeast, Impal, Calcutta, Chittagong was the most hit. They, I think, bombed Chittagong, if I remember right, at least 10 or 12, over 10 times, yeah.
Just one question there.
One at the back.
Yeah.
So
Hi.
just-
Does your book also deal with the presence of Americans in India? They were fighting, I think, in Calcutta and some parts of Northeast. There were a lot of
Yeah.
Americans.
So it does. I mean, it talks about the the increasing number of soldiers. More Indians were inducted because of World War II, because the British wanted someone there, and British soldiers came as well. And so there were American GIs. There is a section on how the influx of foreign soldiers also contributed to the FAP. So the FLAP is a result of many things. You bring anti-aircraft gunners into Jamshedpur, and people think something is going to happen, so they flee. So they see foreign soldiers coming in, and they start fleeing. So there are various stories of foreign soldiers coming in and people fleeing. And there's also this belief that foreign soldiers would, and just the general presence of the army, and this would create problems for women. So people are sending women off, saying, they shouldn't be there. There's also bits on how there's a great surge in sex work as a result of foreign soldiers coming in because they have money. And Calcutta, again, was sort of witnessed this huge surge in so the impact of foreign soldiers coming in is huge and plays a role in actually people fleeing as well, as do many other things. For instance, the British built slit trenches. They took lots of these air raid precaution measures, passive defense measures. So can you believe that in Calcutta alone and its suburbs, 149 miles of slit trenches were built? This is just for people to jump in case aircraft come in. So when all this activity was happening, I think Indians felt, look, there was an imminent invasion. And also they knew that the British had lost in Malaya. The British lost everything. Japan was just on the rampage. They lost Malaya, they lost Singapore, they lost Dutch Sumatra, they were on the run in Burma. there was not a single thing the British won before the Americans took out the the Japanese naval fleet in a couple of battles towards the end of 1942. The British won nothing. They, of course, they talk up the victory towards the end in 1944 when the Japanese come in actually into Assam, and then General Slim pushes them back and retakes Burma. But by that time, the Japanese Navy, which was the sort of, the spearhead of their military muscle, that had been virtually destroyed.
We just have another minute, so we can take one last question and then.
Hi, Mukund. My question is, from your writing desk to the printer to when it finally comes in all our hands, a writer's journey is essentially very solitary. But can you share with us a little bit about what your journey through your writing experience of this book, as someone who's a journalist and as well as a novelist and as well as now an academic, just a personal insight to your own journey as a writer.
So I started writing this without, very quietly, without telling anyone. And then somebody heard I was doing it in the publishing world and got in touch with me and saying, hey, we're very interested. Can you send me a chapter? And so I got caught into the world of publishing that way. But there was stuff I'd written, and then COVID came in the way. And so there was no possibility of traveling. And so I did what I could with the existing sources without the ability to travel. And so it was only after I could travel to England and spend some time there that I was able to complete this book. So this book was not written conventionally. Parts of it of what could be written were written, parts of it that couldn't be written were not written, and then it was, parts were woven in. So it was a sort of unusual journey, I think. I didn't have everything in front of me and then, okay, I'll sit down and write it.